Hey guys, I just want to say thank you for listening to the podcast. It truly means the world to me. I produce the podcast not to seek acclaim for myself, but to glorify God. And talking about producing a podcast, I need to pay a few bills before we can start the episode. So let me tell you about the best podcasting platform available. Anchor Podcast lies well above the best platforms. Anchor is the easiest way to produce a podcast, free of charge, with no hidden fees. Anchor offers creative tools that let you save and edit your podcast from your phone or laptop. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a great deal more. You can earn money with your podcast without a minimal audience. It's everything you need to create a podcast in one spot. Getting started, simply download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started right now. Okay. Let's get to the podcast already. Luke chapter 18, verse 1. Now he was telling them a parable to show them that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart. Here again we find a parable recorded only in Luke's gospel, and Luke places it directly after the discourse upon his return. Although that doesn't necessarily mean that it happened at the same moment. It is just as likely that Luke felt it was appropriate to place it here because it had bearing on the previous conversation. The opening parable in chapter 18 and the one that follows in verse 9 also share somewhat of a unique characteristic among Luke's parables. They both begin with a statement about why Jesus told these particular stories. In this case, we are told that Jesus wants the disciples to pray and not to lose heart. And the phrase translated lose heart in the Greek can also be translated to mean not to grow weary or faint, meaning Jesus wanted to give the disciples a reason not to give up or to be discouraged in their appointed work, and they should continue to pray in their afflictions. This would have been a natural issue to raise at this point in light of what Jesus had taught in chapter 17. Jesus had given the disciples a grim report of what to expect in the days immediately before his return. A depraved world where the enemy seemed to be taking control. And even though the disciples had no idea how long it would be prior to Jesus' return, every generation of believers since Christ has seen persecution of the church somewhere in the world. So no matter how close any given generation may be to Christ's return, it could still identify with the thinking that underlies these verses. When persecution comes, don't lose heart, don't grow weary of keeping the faith and doing God's will. In the case of the disciples, it would be natural to grow weary and discouraged in light of what they faced in their lifetimes. Virtually all the disciples experienced martyrdom, and they experienced many other trials along the way to their deaths. Considering how they must have been assuming that the Messiah's coming to earth would usher in peace and justice, the thought that it wasn't going to happen for some time would be discouraging in itself. So discouragement would have been an easy thing to experience, but this discouragement is hardly limited to the disciples. The opening verse uses language that makes it clear that Jesus is talking about a larger periscope of time. The term at all times is a specific reference to the period between Jesus' departure and his return to judge the world. He discusses it at the end of chapter 17 and gives us the proper context for the coming conclusion. The time until the day of the Son of Man is a period in view. This is the time period when all the disciples are serving their master in his physical absence. So every disciple should hear these words of Christ. Don't lose heart and keep praying, even though your circumstances may be bleak. And to prove this point, Jesus tells a parable about a widow and an unrighteous judge. Luke chapter 18, verse 2 through Luke chapter 18, verse 8, saying, In a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, Give me legal protection from my opponent. For a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, Even though I do not fear God, nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now, will not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry out to him day and night, and he will delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on this earth? This parable and the one that follows are somewhat unique in that they are both structured by contrast rather than comparisons. Do you remember your high school English class? Your teacher tells you to compare and contrast two types of writing. To compare was to find similarities. To contrast was to look for differences. Most of Jesus' parables are designed to draw comparisons, like the kingdom and the mustard seed, servants and masters. But this is one of the few parables where the main point is made by drawing a contrast, though you can also find lesson comparisons being made as well. So let's sort it out. In the parable, we have the judge and the widow. These characters are interesting because they form a contrast of their own. The judge was one of the most powerful people in Jewish society. Since the Romans had conquered the Jews, all of the powerful governmental positions were being held by the Romans. So the only positions of power available to the Jewish society were the judges of the Jewish laws, or the Torah. So this man was about as powerful as a Jew could have been in Jesus' day. And on the other end of the social scale, you had the widow. She was by far the least powerful member in Jewish society. She had no inheritance, no income, no protector. This is why you see the scriptures give so much attention to the fate of widows. So immediately, we're struck by the contrast, the least powerful in society making an appeal to the most powerful in society. We're told this judge is unrighteous. Specifically, he does not fear God nor respect man. This is pretty dramatic when you consider that his role is to judge according to God's law. Today, you wouldn't be very surprised to find judges who do not fear God nor respect man. But in Jesus' day, it would have been a bit scandalous to hear of such a man. Then there was the widow, who continues to approach the judge, asking for protection from her opponent. It's important to note, at this point, she's just asking the judge to do his job. A judge is supposed to provide justice for those who deserve it. Jesus uses the word protection, which in the Greek also means to vindicate. So you could read this to give vindication from her enemies. At this point, she is confident in her own innocence before God's law, and yet she is being accused of violating the law. So she's asking the judge to vindicate her, to declare that she isn't in violation of the law, to show that she is righteous and her opponents are the guilty ones. And this is something a judge should certainly do. We're told the judge is unwilling to give protection at first, but due to the woman's persistence, the judge relents, and he gives her what she requests. Interestingly, the phrase in Greek that's translated "wear me out" is an idiom, translated literally to strike under the eye, or it could be said, "Lest she give me a black eye." In other words, the man is saying, I need to do what I should to protect this woman, otherwise she might give me a black eye, or she will ruin my reputation. So this is what motivates this unrighteous judge to finally do his job, is his own concern for his reputation, as stained as it may be. So then Jesus helps us by making the contrast. Remember, this isn't a comparison, so we're not suggesting that God is like the unrighteous judge. I'm saying he's unlike the unrighteous judge. Now there is a small comparison in the midst of the overall contrast. We, believers, are like the widow in that we have very little power and practically no standing in the world. And like the judge in the parable, God is infinitely more powerful, and he is the only one we can appeal to for justice and protection from our enemies. And since we know that God is truly righteous, how much more should we expect him to do what is right? If the unrighteous man was finally willing to do what was right on the basis of protecting his reputation, shouldn't we expect God to do what is right for the sake of his name and his reputation? But what do we learn from the parable? It's not enough to simply say that the parable is teaching that God answers prayers for protection and justice. That is true, but we didn't need this parable to teach us that, nor did the disciples. They would have had little reason to doubt God would do those things. The problem comes when you combine this parable with what Jesus taught earlier in the chapter. The disciples are going to experience a lifetime of waiting. And more than their own lifetime, the waiting is going to continue long after the disciples are gone. That's the one feature of the parable that's easy to overlook. The woman eventually got what she asked from the judge. But look at the time it took to get it. She had to wait a long time before she got justice, and in the meantime, she suffered under persecution. But in the end, her persistence was met with satisfaction. And here, the parable offers one last opportunity for comparison rather than contrast. Like the woman's situation, we can expect that our persistence for justice will result in satisfaction. But are you prepared to wait your entire lifetime or even longer? Are you prepared to hear that God will not bring the justice and protection we are asking until the day of the Son of Man? Can you wait that long and still not lose heart? Not cease to pray for protection and justice, even knowing that it might not happen in your lifetime? What true measure of persistence and faith, being willing to pray and maintain trust in God to act, even if it doesn't happen in time to save you from your own peril. Remember, the disciples were all martyrs. They never saw God act in their day to remove persecution or bring ultimate justice. Now, this doesn't preclude God from taking immediate action on behalf of his children in the meantime, and he does this all the time. Missionaries are saved from hostile tribes. Churches are saved from financial ruin. Family and individuals saved from any number of hardships. But ultimate justice can only come upon Christ's return. And just in case the disciples were tempted to measure their own success by what they see with their eyes, Jesus gives them a sobering postscript in verse 8. He says, when the time of waiting ends, when the judge finally returns and answers those persistent prayers for justice, what will he find? Will he find faith on earth? Will he find the earth full of those waiting to receive him and welcome him? Will those who preach the gospel have succeeded in persuading the world to the truth? To all these questions, the implied answer is clearly no. Therefore, don't lose heart, don't cease praying, and don't let your eyes and ears deceive you. Don't begin to think that because your own efforts to carry the gospel forward haven't been met with a revival at every turn cause you to doubt your mission. Don't let the fact that the message brings criticism and persecution rather than acceptance and joy leave you feeling discouraged over the prospects for the future. Yes, there is a bleak future for the earth as a whole, which is why you can't use the state of things on earth as an excuse to give up hope. The opposite is actually true. The hopelessness of the earth is your reason to persevere and press forward in bringing the news of God's love through Christ, so that by our obedience and perseverance, God may save some. Some might ask, why persist in prayer for God's justice when the day of its arrival is already determined and set? Remember that prayer is a privilege that God grants to his children. And when we exercise that privilege, we benefit from the opportunity to spend time in his presence, regardless of the circumstances. We may never realize the benefit until we are glorified and all things are made known.